Fisher, Deputy Chief for Public Services here at the Central Branch. This evening, it is my pleasure to introduce Andre M. Perry and moderator Carsonia Wise Whitehead for this Writers Live program. Andre M. Perry is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution and the director of its Center for Community Uplift, as well as a professor of practice of economics at Washington University in St. Louis. A nationally known and respected commentator on race, structural inequality in education, Perry is a regular contributor to MSNBC and has been published by numerous national media outlets, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, The Nation, Bloomberg, CNN, to name a few. His research focuses on race and structural inequality, education, and economic inclusion. Carsonia Wise Whitehead is an educator, author, speaker, documentary, filmmaker, and the host of Today with Dr. K on WEAA 88.9 FM. She is the founding director of the Carson Institute for Race, Peace, and Social Justice, as well as a communication and African American Studies professor at Loyola University. Please join me in welcoming Andre Perry and moderator Dr. K to discuss his latest work, Black Power Scorecard, Measuring the Racial Gap and What We Can Do to Close It.
Thank you so much. I'm excited about tonight's conversation.
Yeah, so am I.
So why don't we get on to it? First of all, hello, everyone. Thank you for coming out this evening. It's always wonderful here in Baltimore City that we have the prac to be able to have these very important conversations. I spent some time reading through your book, and I want to kind of start at the beginning. So can you just talk a little bit about the research that went into the Black Power Scorecard, but how that research directly impacts your life as an individual, and then our lives as a community?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me. It's always a pleasure to be in Baltimore. I actually have some roots here. In the early 90s, I worked under Freeman Hrabowski, who is UMBC president, recently retired. Learned a lot from him. But actually, when you're talking about research, you got to start with what kind of question you're asking. And for me, during 2020, the summer of unrest, in the midst of the aftermath of the killing of George Floyd, there was a lot of rumblings around the question around the statement Black Lives Matter. And for me, I didn't necessarily debate whether we should say all lives matter, or Black Lives Matter too, or whatever. For me, I saw an empirical question in it. I asked myself, what are the most important factors on life expectancy? And the reason why I asked that is too often we base political agendas, movements on, particularly around Black people, around what harms us, as opposed to what helps us thrive. And so for me, really doing an examination on the factors that contribute to our well-being, our longevity, was very important. So in 2022, I started doing a project in collaboration with the NAACP, as well as my colleague at Gallup, Jonathan Rothwell. We created this dashboard called the Black Progress Index. And what we did was try to identify the places where Black people are living the longest. Right, and we use this fancy machine learning algorithm, lasso regression, if you got statisticians out there. It's a type of regression analysis that allows you to see the most impactful correlates on life expectancy. So we ran dozens of databases, everything from IRS data, Fed Reserve data, crime statistics, Facebook data, everything we could find. and it goes through this machine learning algorithm, and it spits out the most important factors on life expectancy. And we narrowed it down to 13. Some of these things you probably can guess: income, education, home ownership, property ownership in the main. You see everything from air quality, but there were some surprising things.
And that's what I wanted to get to.
Yeah. So
Yes.
we can talk, but I'll say that there are many cities that exceed national averages, that exceed expectations, and that was also my goal, to find what a city is predicted to be, and then look if it exceeds that prediction. It's like saying, if you're predicting the weather's going to be 75 degrees, and it's 80, either something's wrong with the model for measuring, or there's something going on in the environment. While we know that there's nothing ever wrong with my models, but something's probably going on in the environment. So I also just look for places that are exceeding expectations when it comes to well-being.
I'm so glad you kind of laid it out that way, because we have this conversation a lot in Baltimore. You're familiar with Baltimore.
Oh, yeah.
In terms of being ground zero for redlining, in terms of the impact of the environment, in terms of thinking about police brutality, all the factors that you talk about in your book, which lowers life expectancy.
That's right.
So I want to start narrow, just where you started, and then kind of make it broad, because I know many people are from Baltimore here. We know that in certain communities in Baltimore City, if you use Freddie Gray's community, that if you just go 5 miles away to where, say, Loyola University, or what they call the White L is, there's a 20-year life expectancy in a 5-mile radius.
Right.
Just being born 5 miles away, you're adding 20 years, all things staying the same,
Right.
to your life. Can you kind of drill down a little bit to help us really understand why all the factors we talked about at the top, from redlining to poverty to police brutality to the collapse of the schools, all of that, along with what you talk about in your book, the lack of home ownership, takes away years from your life?
Yeah, it's not about geography as much as, while we can certainly identify life expectancy, what it means is the neighborhood conditions
Right.
in those places are not conducive for flourishing. And so we certainly point to redlining because, and most people know me through my work on housing devaluation.
Yes. That's how I know you.
Yeah, and so my research in 2018, we looked at homes in black neighborhoods, and we compared them to homes in white neighborhoods. And we controlled for, attended to everything from education, crime, walkability, all those fancy Zillow metrics. And what we found is that homes in black communities, after controlling for those factors to get an apples-to-apples comparison, homes in black communities are still underpriced by 23%, about $48,000 per home. Cumulatively, it's about $156 billion in lost equity. And just to put this in perspective so that people can understand, $156 billion would have financed more than 4 million black-owned businesses based upon the average amount black people use to start their firms. It would have paid for more than 8 million four-year degrees based upon the average amount black people use to pay for public school tuition. Replaced the pipes in Flint, Michigan 3,000 times over. Would have covered nearly all of Hurricane Katrina damages, double the annual burden of the opioid crisis. It's a big number. And it's one of the reasons why I say, like it keeps my teeth white, that there's nothing wrong with black people that ending racism can't solve. Right? That when things go wrong in black communities, what do? We blame black people.
Yep.
We don't look at the underlying conditions and policies that impact those numbers. So for me, when you're talking about Baltimore, you have to talk about redlining, but not as something that has happened in the past.
Something that's happening now.
Those things
happening.
certainly had some, antecedents in the past, but it tells you that something's going on now in these places. And it is absolutely clear. Revenue and resources predict for outcome. So I typically put it this way. If you're growing a head of lettuce and the lettuce isn't growing, you don't blame the lettuce.
Right,
You
right.
look to see if the soil's enriched. You look to see if it's getting sunlight, if it's getting rainwater. You never blame the lettuce. And so for me, when I see communities in Baltimore, in Chicago, in New Orleans, I'm looking at the soil. I'm looking whether it's getting rainwater, whether it's getting sunlight. And so for me, and let me be clear, there are lots of places where black people are thriving. But it's not by coincidence. It's because they're getting investment. Nothing grows without investment. So when you're talking about Baltimore, there's a lot of good things happening here. Like life expectancy in Baltimore is lower than the national average. But what is also true, that it's bettering the expectation here. So there are good things going on in Baltimore. Business ownership rates are higher here. But the story is West Baltimore is bad. And there's certainly challenges here. What the story doesn't say is what's the lack of investment here. So certainly I talk about history and structural racism, all those things. But for me, what's more important is the here and now. What is not happening here that should be happening that could lead to better outcomes?
So that's where we're starting, thinking about Baltimore City, because this idea of thinking about the soil and not necessarily what's growing from the soil, that the soil has to be rich.
That's right.
Because when you look at the outcomes, because I went back and I took a look at what you wrote and then kind of compared it to Baltimore. And say the interesting thing about here is that it's almost neighborhood by neighborhood when you look at life expectancy. Depending upon all those factors that you mentioned, just being in that environment alone feeds into everything. As you said, it's not necessarily the environment, it's what comes out of it.
Right.
So it's not necessarily having a job, it's the fact that having a job gives you stability.
That's
stability leads to being able to take care of your health, get more rest. Like all those things come from just having that single source of income. Can you talk for a minute about something you write about in terms of home ownership actually adds years to your life in terms of life expectancy?
Yeah, and it is very intuitive, but when you have home ownership, you have stability, right? Stability. Now, you can get stability in a number of ways, but when you are renting, you are subjected to rent increases. You might be forced to move, and so you're going to have variability in your income. You got to figure out your transportation. But home ownership also predicts for civic engagement. Ownership in general, particularly for the descendants of the enslaved, for people who were once owned, to own property, to hire employees, it means something different, right? But when I say home ownership, I want to be clear. I'm not talking about at an individual level. When home ownership rates are higher overall in an area, that's where you get better outcomes. So for me, what I also do in the book, if you see, I want to beat back against this individualistic notion of wealth building. We have to think about community wealth, what it means to be a strong community. Because when you have community wealth, you have better outcomes. And too often, the conversation is about how can I be rich, right? And we know too well that there's too many nefarious ways to get rich. I joke, I don't joke. I say in the first chapter, I quote Jay-Z, who famously said in the album 444, what's better than one billionaire? Two, especially if they're the same hue as you. Now, I critique that because it makes little sense. In this regard, it's always been about the means of production. If you making $1 billion means that you're going to suppress somebody's wages, not give somebody health care, extract wealth and opportunity, which always happens in the music industry, one billionaire is not better than two. And for the descendants of the enslaved, this is it's almost personal for me. That we've always had people who've mastered how to be a better capitalist all throughout time. I mean, from Walker to all these
Virginia.
all these rich people, they figured out how to replicate white capitalism, right? And so for me, I always go back to the ultimate exploitive practice, which was slavery, right? Would we ever ask what's better than one slaveholder? Two, right? No, absolutely not. So why are we saying, let's make more billionaires? Now, I just want to be clear. I am not against individuals making money. I want people to make money. I don't want them to make money on the backs of communities. And we need to be very disciplined about our businesses, who we're selling to, what we're selling. These are the practices that we need to hold each other accountable to. The whole title of Black Power Scorecard, in essence, is an ask for us to hold ourselves accountable to outcomes. Every election cycle, Black issues are shoehorned in at the last minute,
Yes. Yes.
and when in fact we need a set of criteria and metrics that we're always examining. How is home ownership? How is business ownership? How is the environment? How is safety, crime, strong families? I talk about families in this. I talk about these things. But for me, we should not have to wait the last minute for a candidate to say, well, here's what I'm doing for Black communities. We already should be able to see what you're doing for Black communities, right? So for me, I am very disciplined about saying, here are the most significant factors that literally adds years to your life or takes them away. And what we won't find in the book, you won't find conversations about how many comedians are going to the White House.
No.
You won't hear about how many Grammys Beyonce won. You won't hear about changing the Little Mermaid black. Like, these things are immaterial.
You don't talk about the performative thing.
No.
It's about building that wealth.
Swag surfing on the White House lawn, that is not it. No. And so we just have to be very disciplined about the things that matter most. And I'm not trying to throw shade, but oftentimes we've accepted consolation prizes in exchange for, instead of real policy.
Right.
And so for me, it's like, let's work on policy. And let me say one more thing real quick about this. So much talk about executive order, right? And about DEI and affirmative action. I want to make things clear and follow me through. DEI and affirmative action have never been the goals of Black Power.
No.
We've always sought to get mainstream access to capital markets, to get home ownership the way everyone else gets home ownership, to have the ability to have clean environments. What many DEI programs have been is sort of a recognition that companies, governments discriminate. And so we need ways to remedy and work towards access, right? But they were never the goals. Now, let's be clear, the current administration and members of it use DEI as a slur to undercut
progress of Black people.
To discriminate, to discriminate. But the point I want to make is that we must have a legislative agenda that can't go away from president to president. It must be something that we work on, and that's harder. Executive order is just a lot easier than getting legislation passed. But what I asked for in Black Power Scorecard is to demand the things that matter most.
Okay, so why don't we unpack this? So thank you for laying that out and having us think a little bit more about what we're demanding from those in power. I also want us to realize that we are in a different moment in terms of thinking about legislative power, thinking about what it is that we want to do. We have to recognize, I don't know, and I want to get to talking about kind of getting through this moment because something different is happening. than what we could have done under even another Republican president, another Democratic. Something different is happening at this moment. So I do want to get into that. But I want to go back and kind of unpack some of the other things that you laid on the table.
Yep.
When we start talking about community wealth and community building, that this idea that people tap into, and they don't even know they're doing it, when they say, oh, I don't want renters in the community. We want to make sure that everyone owns their home on the block, because they know if we have home ownership, they don't necessarily see it as connecting to community wealth.
Right.
They see it to a way of having accountability in the community. Right. We also see education as his kind of lifeline leading into having financial stability. You talk about how when white kids graduate from college, they're giving access to money. And that when black people graduate from college, we then have to give up money. Like the expectation is, because you've graduated, and when you said that, you got really emotional. I'm like, me too, brother. Like the expectation is that the more you have, the more you can give. But I understand where that's coming from.
Absolutely.
If you come from a community where when you went to college like I did, everybody gave. I mean, everybody gave $1, $5. Like you would think I was like moving around the world. With the expectation is that once you graduate, then you're going to come back and grandma needs a new roof, and pop needs to get his leg fixed. That go to the one that graduated from college, because for our community, college means wealth. So can you talk about
in that particular line, it is personal, because the Fed Reserve did a study a few years back that showed the intergenerational wealth transfers by race. And as was stated, that when members of white families graduate from college, they can expect an intergenerational wealth transfer. They can get a car, they get money for a down payment for a home, they may even get money to put down on a wedding ring. But when black people, this is where it got personal, when I graduated from college, the family comes up, they all giving you $50, $100, $200, right? And you feel rich after like wow, I got big money grip. I'm here. And then auntie comes up, my roof is leaking. And you have to. You have to, because you're responsible. But what that leads to is an inability to generate wealth over time. And so for me, I'm also very disciplined about, we have to have new outlets, new asset classes, so that we can develop wealth. How discrimination, particularly for home ownership, shows up is a lack of down payment. We have thousands of people in every market who did everything right, have good credit scores, but cannot save up enough for a down payment. And what that requires is a new kind of mortgage product, right? And in the book, in the home ownership section, I spend a lot of time talking about special purpose credit programs. And for those who don't know, special purpose credit programs are programs that banks do, where you can change the underwriting practices, which will enable you to give a loan, say, without a down payment. You can change the down payment size. And why that's important, like I said, if you were that student that graduated from college and you've done everything right and you just can't save up, you just need another type of product. And by the way, a lot of people in this room are paying rent above what they would pay in a mortgage, right? So we can find the people, what we call the invisible prime borrowers, the people who are ready to take on a mortgage, and get them the product, particularly in places like Baltimore, where you have stock, right? We just need, and this is where government comes in, and I'm always clear about this. You'll hear me say this over and over again. We're not going to nonprofit our way out of these problems. Eventually, we do need private industry and government to work for us. Where philanthropy can come in is to demonstrate what is possible when it is resourced and codified eventually. Just like redlining.
Right.
Redlining didn't, as you stated, did not start at the federal government. It started in Baltimore. It was eventually resourced and codified by the federal government, but it started here. Why not resource and codify the innovation that's happening in Baltimore.
Right.
And so for me, and I specifically in the chapter on Buy Back the Block, 40 Acres in a Mall, that's what I'm talking about in that effort, about how we can take this past discrimination, present day discrimination, and address it with real life innovation that could eventually be resourced and codified.
Let's talk a little bit about Montgomery County versus Baltimore, just to use that as an example. Because you're saying Montgomery County, you're talking living until, what, 83 years of age,
83
right?
years old.
And Baltimore City, 63, 20-year difference. Now, when you add that on top of the 20-year difference that's here with a 5-mile radius, I mean, you're really getting into some serious numbers here. Can you kind of lay out for us, when you mentioned earlier, some of the most important factors that add years to your life? We have 2 examples right here in Maryland. And then we can just kind of go on the opposite of what takes it away, because we have an idea of some of the struggles in Baltimore
Yeah,
City.
so we mentioned home ownership rates are down here, property ownership rates are down. Incomes are generally higher here relative to other places. And so that
Which I know is hard to believe.
It's
but
hard to believe.
But you have to think about the universities, the hospitals. You got to think about the ways in which people are accumulating wealth through income here. Even teachers are paid higher rates here because of the situation.
And I should have mentioned this. I don't compare black people to white people.
Yeah, no.
I compare black people to black people all across the country. So we can see the variation. And so in Baltimore, incomes are generally higher. However, there's some other negative drags. One of the negative predictors, and we can talk about this, is around religious adherence. So places that are more religious actually predict for lower life expectancy. Now, what does that mean? Remember,
I didn't like this section, y'all.
Now, before people, I know somebody like, you little Philistine.
Come on, going into Easter weekend. Come on, y'all.
Oh, this heathen. Shame the devil. No, but this is correlation, right?
Yeah.
So what it's probably saying is that, one, churches in areas that have less private and public investment are probably more active. 2, what it's saying is that congregants are probably going into church suffering.
Right.
Right? And why I bring that up, and I do talk through this, we absolutely need church leaders to be part of the solution. Right? There are problems. The whole shut the doors type of thing revealed some critical issues, right? But churches are an undeniable part of the solution. Right. Their congregants are proximate to the issues. And so I actually feel we've abandoned our leveraging of religious leaders in that regard. But this is where I do put a lot on religious leaders, faith leaders, that we also must talk about community development, even beyond the church. Own property, develop the land. Like, it's not, I mean, I know the organizations that are about saving souls. They also must be the organizations about enriching the community, right? And so for me, you have that in Baltimore. Without question, gun violence, gun fatalities are the number one drag on life expectancy. And it's not just the loss of life.
It's the impact.
The impact of loss of life. So, and that's, again, I do not shy away from these things. You have to talk about violence. I'll share a little bit about the feedback when I wrote the book. There were 2 areas that I put in the book that I said you have to talk about. You have to talk about crime, and you have to talk about marriage.
I was going to go there next, about this marriage as the solvent for things around poverty.
So
I'm going to have you finish the violence piece, though.
So the violence piece is correlational. You have to address it, but how you address it is you don't take away positive indicators. So when you jail people, you're taking away income. You're taking away people, human power. You got to figure out a way to add to communities. Remember, you're about investing. So, but this is the hard part about this kind of development. You know, jailing is not a solution, but people don't want to hear that you need to increase education, you need to increase crime.
Factors that lead up to the violence.
Yeah,
yes.
right. So for me, it does take innovation in this space, because the long-term solutions are oftentimes not palatable for the public. Now, on the marriage thing, this is interesting. You know, I actually recently went through a divorce, and I tell a little story about a trip to the hospital with my son. He had to go to the hospital. I was nervous. I'm not involved in healthcare systems. I was just scared. And one day he had a fever, burning up. I literally carried him to my car, put him in. We drove to the emergency room. I mean, he is just not able to move. We get him triaged. He's laying in the bed. I mean, I've never prayed so hard in my life, because he's just laying there, and I felt helpless. Eventually took some tests. The physician came in. He said, "Oh, he's going to be all right. He has COVID." Right? And I breathed a sigh of relief, because she said he's going to be fine. We went back home, laid him down. I go to my room, and I'm sitting on my bed, and I go, "Man, it's hard being a single mother." Very hard. You know, but this is the thing. The statistic that shows up in the Black Power Scorecard, the share of children not living with their father. Now, why is that important? Remember, this is correlates. The share, but if you live with your father, particularly somebody like me, being a male often can cover, in terms of income, what a partner would bring, right? So living with a male, not living with a male, you're not getting that additional income, right? And so why men should work on wage discrimination is for this reason, right? That when you don't live with the male, the woman oftentimes gets less resources than her counterparts. So that's one reason. Also, when you have fewer jobs, increased incarceration rates, it just makes it much more difficult for child rearing, particularly for fathers, because in general, you see literally less men in an environment. And so why I talk about marriage, I say, look, we need to stop talking about marriage as a solvent for poverty, right? That's not the way we should look at it. But if you listen to any podcast, it's about what black men are doing, or about
get married, and that'll save everything.
You're right. No. It's about, for me, it's about saying healthy communities build healthy relationships. You know, you're not going to marry poverty away. You're not going to marry lower wages away. You're not going to marry bad educational systems away. But when we work on these things together, relationships are a lot stronger, a lot stronger. So, but again, we have to talk about marriage. We have to talk about crime, but we must talk about it in a way that we're not blaming the lettuce. That's the thing. So I allow the correlates to speak, and in Baltimore, we do have a high rate of children not living with their father. We have lower home ownership. We have density. Density is an interesting thing. Typically, high density leads to better outcomes, but for black people, leads to negative outcomes.
It leads to negative income.
So what it's saying is, if you live in cities where there's high density, it generally means there's probably discrimination in those cities. Less dense places, black people do better, right? And all of these things, I say we're not going to just move to other places, right? And things be better. One thing I learned about all my appraisal studies is that discrimination follows black people. Right. You think you move into like Montgomery, let me go to Montgomery County real quick. Everybody going to Montgomery County. It doesn't work that way.
Yep.
Right? You know, so for me, it's about let's deal with the conditions that are here. And this is what I also learned from a lot of my research around housing devaluation. Our assets are much more stronger than they are priced.
Absolutely.
Right? So let's recognize we have assets. We just need the investment, and then we'll grow.
Let's talk about education, because I really wrestled with your information around marriage as somebody who's married, around the church. I'm in the church. I was like, okay, he's speaking directly to me.
That's right.
I don't agree with any of it. But you let the correlates speak for themselves. Like,
Right.
I was thinking, what does it mean now that you have so many women who are more educated
Right.
than their husbands? So they come into the market making more money. How do we account for that? How do we account for a professor being married to a teacher? And it's like, well, if I come in making twice the income that you have, but I have to take into account what happens when you have the gender pay gap, and then the racial pay gap, and then thinking about Kimberly Crenshaw's idea of intersectionality and how all those pieces come together, and even just the emotional support. So I thought a lot about the marriage piece, and a lot about what does it mean for us to begin to raise our children in a more community-centered way. I mean, because that is something that the church used to do.
Right.
It wasn't just a place you go to kind of spend your Sunday. It was a part of the community. And that is something that if we do kind of a historical outreach, which is my area, looking at Black history, what does it mean for the church to no longer be the center of the community,
right.
which is where you go for food and community and fun and help when you need, we have an issue with your children, which we don't have anymore.
You know, and I do have a personal story where that relates. I was informally adopted by an older woman in the hood that took in kids at the time. My mother was poor when she had my older brother. She had him at 15, had me at 17, had my other brother at 19, had my sister at 21. But at the time when this deal was made that Mom, Elsie Boyd, took me in, my mother was probably abused. My father was a heroin addict. He was in and out of prison and jail. He eventually was murdered in prison.
I'm sorry.
I didn't know him, and so I mean, there's some stories around that. My family always said, "Oh, your dad died breaking up a fight," and I was like, "Okay, he's not like." Something's not right. I don't know about that. I hear what you're trying to do. Good Samaritan. I don't know.
Not sure.
Right. But she took in me, and she took in a bunch of kids. And I just want to be clear about this, because a lot of people hear that story, and if I'm in a big room, somebody invariably says, "Well, what did your mom do? What did you do? What makes you so different?" And I said, "Oh, I'm no different." One, I am no different. Actually, my father should be on the stage, right? Now, what is different, that woman owned a home. She owned a home through, it was actually her son's home through the GI Bill. He was it was one area of town where returning soldiers could own or utilize their GI Bill. So he had a home where I lived and one up the street. And she owned a home, but guess what she did with it? She leveraged it to help the people in our neighborhood. Because it was, I was born in 1970. It was right when the U.S. Steel started to pull out. Unemployment was at 20% for everyone, which is meant it's probably like 30% for Black people.
Right.
I mean, generally, Black unemployment rates double that of white rates. So it was had to be super high. Lots of people needed a home. Mom had a home, and those children are doing well. It was because there was assets in the community.
Right.
Now, a lot of my research really comes from that. I really have a hard time distinguishing the difference between an aunt, an uncle, a cousin. Like, I have to think about, oh, uncle is the brother of, you know, when I look at people, I kind of put them in uncle, auntie, cousin, because they're all like brother, sister. My guy Sean here, that's my brother. He's just my brother because we share a fate. And I challenge us to say we have to go back to some of that. Because when I say it is natural for me to call somebody, that's my auntie. It is so natural, and really believe it. Really believe it. So, but in this day and age, you talk about some of the challenges. We are in a selfie culture for real.
For real, yeah.
Like, everybody's out for self.
Yeah.
And those kind of practices just don't hold up. Now, why that's important, we simply don't have the wealth to be so individualistic. We have to have some communal principles at play. And when I talk about this in the book, what it means is that our ownership practices must be communal. We need new ways to own property, new ways to share equity, new ways to share land. That is what I'm talking about. It's not just working for each other. It's that the apparatus for wealth building has to change.
And we see some of that in Baltimore City. I immediately thought about some of the co-ops that have been developed and people growing food in their own neighborhood, or something that Reverend Heber Brown, who's here in Baltimore City with the Black Church Food Security Network, telling Black churches, you have this land, why not teach the community how to grow their own food, so if there is an issue, we can have food in our community. We don't have to wait for food to be delivered. We are growing it ourselves. I want to talk about education, and then I want to get to thinking about some of the tips and strategies you will give to people to make it through this moment. So a study recently came out that showed that, just using Maryland as an example, that boys in Maryland are one full grade plus 1 month behind girls in Maryland when it comes to English scores, that they are falling behind. Can you talk a little bit about the importance of education and how that ties into all these other factors that you laid out?
Yeah, another positive correlate is education, meaning the more advanced you are in either K-12 and higher education, it predicts for life expectancy. Education is absolutely critical. And when there are gaps, there's no way around it. We need more time on task in terms of academic training. What makes it hard is you can't do everything in a school. And I've been involved in school reform all my life. I used to hate when business leaders would say, if we could only fix the schools, everything will be all right. No. Like, one, most of what predicts for educational outcomes actually occur outside of schools. So, what I'm clear about in this book is that education doesn't predict for wealth. Wealth predicts for education.
Yep.
Right? So we literally need to enrich the communities in order to have the outcomes. You can learn French in a classroom, or you can learn French in France. It's a lot easier to learn it in France, right? And so what in the book chapter, I spotlight a brother by the name of Calvin Mackey. He's doing incredible work. He happens to be the older brother of Anthony Mackie, Captain America. And he's in New Orleans. And what he is doing is phenomenal. So on any given Saturday, Sunday, he has what he's called STEM NOLA. So they are essentially doing STEM exercises, classes, projects, all through in stadiums and community centers, giving kids extra at-bats. In addition, he is building building facilities where they're actually doing producing energy in places. So he's actually an energy producer in New Orleans East. If you know, New Orleans is a part of New Orleans. And so he's enriching the community and giving people skills. Why that is important? Now, there's a lot of debates around vouchers, and I'm generally against vouchers for K through 12 schools. I am for vouchers for outside of school, because where wealth inequality shows up is that you don't have the money to put your kid in that high-dose tutoring. You don't have the money to send them to that fancy summer camp. You don't have the money for this and that. That's how it shows up. But what we do use vouchers for currently is to subsidize poor-performing private schools, and we don't need that. So, but the chapter, and also the chapter is also about knowing, and I love Toni Morrison, but she said one thing that never sit with me. She said racism is a distraction. Yeah. And let me tell you, when it comes to critical race theory and the attacks on that, that kind of racism is always a prelude to racist policy.
To what we're saying.
Like,
yes.
So I mean, you got to take that stuff seriously. We know that CRT wasn't taught in
right.
K-12, but it is a warning. Yeah. They're going for your funding.
And that's what they did.
And that's what
and
exactly
that's what
happened. So for me, it's like understanding that that education, and all Black Power movements is about education for self. And so the other thing they always go after is Black history.
Yes.
Right. So
every single time.
So we absolutely need to focus on what matters to enrich the community. So when I talk about education, and I know Nicole's out there, she's a staunch educator, so I hope this doesn't hurt her ears. I focus what's less on in the classroom and more on what's funded, how districts are shaped, right? Because they have starved school districts for centuries now, right? And we move the furniture around inside the school. Like, we literally are turning off the stove while the house is burning down. You know, we have to look at these structures, not like these little things that, you know, they matter some, but not all that much. But education does not predict for wealth. Wealth predicts for education. That's how we should be thinking.
I want to ask you one more question as people begin to think about joining us in this conversation. Perhaps you have a question. We have mics set up on the side. So let's talk about, in this little bit of time we have left, we have mentioned that we're in a different environment. I think that is very clear. You talked a little bit about when they were coming after CRT with the work that I do, when they began to even mention critical race theory and turn it into a slur, and people started getting afraid that their first grader was learning about racism embedded into the law, which was absolutely ridiculous, but you couldn't help people see it, right? So they pick up this terminology and then they go with it. But CRT led to DEI, led to dismantling those programs, and led to the erasure that was intentionally happening around Black history. So a lot of the strategies in the book work under normal conditions. Now, it feels very abnormal right now. What are some of the strategies you would tell people to try to focus on what they can do to get through this moment, if that's even the goal, trying to get through it or survive
Well, and this is where I need us to have discipline as a community. We certainly have LDF, NAACP, LDF. We have the Lawyers Committee. We have lawyers fighting for democracy right now.
every day.
Every single day. And we need that defensive strategy. And we need an offensive strategy. That we need policy. What my book is more geared towards is that offensive side of it. That we can't put all of our eggs in the basket of defending. Some of us, because believe it or not, a year and a half from now, 3.5 years from now, we shouldn't be, all we've done over this last period of time is beat back failing programs, right? And that's what I'm worried about, that we've almost said, and let's be clear, and I'll pick apart DEI and affirmative action. Affirmative action has been winnowed down for 20 years now, right? You know, many of the DEI programs were consolation prizes. We don't want set-asides, right? We want policy to work for us.
Right.
And so for me, I do think there are strategies that we embrace. One thing we did not mention, I just want to mention it. Brother, he's here, Lanier Richardson, purchased.
From Edmondson, yes.
Yeah, Edmondson,
yes.
Edmondson Village Shopping Mall. Purchase it, develop it, and why it's special. It's not just a typical development of a struggling shopping mall. He's utilizing the crowdfunding mechanisms that enable a new class of owner. With as little as $1,000 down, you can actually become an accredited investor and be a shareholder in a development. Mm-hmm. Why is that important? In Baltimore, in which there were racial covenants, and he's discovered the mall had one that blacks could not own in this area. And so now what he's doing is allowing a whole, more than 100 and so, maybe 200, close to 200 new owners of that property. Now, we're not talking about making large sums of cash here. I just want to be clear, and I state that. But for the descendants of the enslaved to now own, to
into
now
a strip mall, like
the
it's not
strip
just
mall. Yeah,
that whole
that
property
whole
there.
area.
Yes.
To develop it, you're providing goods, you're providing services, jobs, right? More importantly, you're developing stability, pride, community. And that to me is much more, that's invaluable. We need to have ownership of our property and our community. So for me, it's a solution.
I add safety because I know that it was in that area where there was a shooting a couple of years ago.
There was a shooting.
Young kid was shot at that Popeyes.
Yeah.
What would it mean when black folks are owning that? There's a different type of responsibility, making sure our children are safe so they can come out of school during lunch and not have to stay in school for fear that they're going to get shot going right across the street.
You know, I didn't talk about this, but the crack epidemic did one thing that it flipped everything on its head. You had kids bullying adults, and people are scared oftentimes of communities. But when you own something, and we all know, there was always some man saying, "Get off my lawn." You know, that's my lawn.
Looking at the screen.
Now, when you have 200 people in a neighborhood that's their problem, you're going to get off that lawn.
Yeah.
Right? So for me, I'm just very practical. I'm not afraid to talk about crime, marriage, religion, all these things, because we have to. We have to have a clear vision. We have to have courage, because if we do not, you're literally taking away years of life from people. And I just refuse to do that.
So we're going to open it up for questions and see if we have some coming across even online.
Yeah. Ooh, just kidding. Yes, we do have time for questions. We have around 10 minutes. So if you have a question, please shimmy on up to where I am standing at the mic and where my associate is standing at the mic on the other side of the room. I have a question from the online audience to start us off, which is, what was the most surprising thing for you to discover during your research for Black Power Scorecard?
I would say the most surprising thing was, the share of black immigrants is the most strongest predictor. And if you are in any kind of educated crowd, you know there's a little bit of a rivalry between the West Indians, Africans, African Americans. Small
rivalry.
Why are we doing well? Why you're not? Type of thing. And there are some compositional effects, meaning black immigrants generally arrive healthier and wealthier than their counterparts. But it is fascinating to see that when immigrants land in a place, they transform it as well in a positive way. I think there is a narrative around immigration that America should pay attention to when it comes to black immigrants, that you truly see the added value. But also let me be clear, the benefits of being an immigrant dissipate with passing generations, which tells you that American racism is bad for your health.
Yes.
Right, so we must appreciate what goes on and take it as a positive story, but also recognize black immigrants face the same things that we're facing every day.
We have 2 questions over here.
Yes, thank you so much for having this conversation. I am a real estate agent here in Maryland, and oftentimes I talk to folks about building wealth via real estate as my own journey. And so I'm trying to figure out a way to kind of help change the conversation in our community. Is there an advice that you can give me to engage?
Oh, absolutely. I applaud your efforts. We need more of that. My colleague, as I mentioned, Lanier Richardson, who's in the audience, he's developed literally a blueprint for purchasing commercial real estate. And you can go online, you can type in Brookings Institution, Buy Back the Block, the playbook, and Lanier Richardson is there, so I want everybody to do that. The reason why I mention that, I think we're pretty clear that home ownership matters, but commercial real estate matters too. And that about 43, it depends on the year, about 43% of all commercial of the revenue generated from real estate comes from the commercial side. So I don't know if you're talking residential, commercial, but I would encourage both. So I would encourage both. I would also encourage, making it clear how to do something. Now, I'm also clear that, again, a lot of people will say financial literacy is the way. No, having resources will make you smart, But people do need a guide.
Right.
We do need guides in this. I mean, you could be a PhD and not know how to purchase a home. Right? And so we do need guides in our community, people who are doing it, offering up sort of lessons, real life lessons. So that's what I would encourage.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
Dr. Perry, good to see you, sir.
Good to see you.
I just had a question, particularly given what is going on right now at the federal level, and given how a lot of your research seems to be very much kind of place-based. Are there specific recommendations within the book, or that you could just add today, to talk to at the municipal level, what policy agenda, legislative agenda, and kind of things that we could do in Baltimore, in Atlanta, in Louisville, while we sue our way out of the craziness that is going on at the federal level?
Yeah, Otis, I think that one, my research was really place-based, so I might be over-indexing the role that municipal and state governments can play, but right now we have to believe in that. That, remember, municipal governments, let's say on real estate, municipal governments are still the largest land owners, property owners in most cities. So we should be encouraging, I talk about this, community, not just community land trusts, but land banks, having robust eminent domain practices, where if you have lines and lines of vacant property, figuring out ways to get those properties back and then get them back into circulation. A lot of that can happen at the municipal level. Certainly the appraisal gaps that you see in development, we can have state-level policy addressing that. So just as a framework, I believe in starting local and then scaling upwards. And so for me, over the next few years in particular, I'm going to be working in communities all across the country. I mentioned Lanier, but I'm working with people all over the country who are trying to figure out ways to do things locally. Because there will come a time, I do believe this, might be people fear that we may not go back to this, but there will be a political window of opportunity where we have to put forth policies. We better be testing them at the local level, right? And then when we have our opportunity, resource and codify them. So start locally. We do need sort of tax rebate innovations because when you have devaluation and you create development, a lot of people can't keep pace with the inevitable tax increases. So we can do some interesting things in terms of tax rebates, TIFs, other practices, and I haven't figured them out yet. But that's what we're supposed to do in this time. If we're going to invest locally, we need to figure out systems to fix these things. Thank you.
We have time for one last question.
Okay, your piece, brother. Do you think when our grandmothers told us in the 40s, 50s, 60s, son, go get an education, do you think that means the same thing today? And secondly, do you think the majority of us know today the difference between education and knowledge?
Oh yeah, I love that question because I do think that it is a difference. There's a distinct difference. Knowledge itself was central when people said go get an education.
That's what they meant.
Right? And right now we treat schools almost like banks. We go in, we want to take a withdrawal out and leave. It's no longer community-based. It's no longer driven by an ethic of we're learning to free ourselves. Like, remember, education for Black people around the world, actually, was an affront to slavery, right? That to truly be free is to be educated. To truly be free is to know how you are being enslaved. And for us, we've kind of lost, I think the reason why I'm here, because I did receive a good education. There are lots of us out there, I don't want to discount that. But in general, I do think we are treating schooling almost like it's, something you take out of a bank and you don't really do much with it, and it's exchange for income. And let me be clear, it can't just be about getting a better job. It has to be about building a better community.
That takes us back to the beginning.
That's right.
What are the ways in which we are depositing into our community? What are we looking to get from the community? It's kind of symbiotic relationship.
That's right.
I like what you said when you said that the notion of what happens in school is not as important in the long run as what's happening in and around the school.
Right.
What's happening in the community. That's that notion. That's why I think schools should be one of the ways in which young people are being educated. Where are the freedom schools happening on Saturday? What are we doing, on Sunday evenings? What are the other ways that we're educating our young
just be
people?
clear, because I know the educators are going to throw something at me. I really believe in schools. I just also think that schools reflect the community. And there's no way out of that. They reflect the community. So we have to enrich the schools themselves and what's around it.
And we can't expect the schools to be everything,
Everything.
to the students. I spend time in Baltimore City schools. They're expecting you to be, just to fill every single need because the community is struggling. So the school takes the weight of that. How do we balance that a little bit
Yeah,
more?
I'll just add, because I tried this. I mean, people don't understand. I was a educator for a while. I led 4 charter schools. So why I'm a little bit critical of charter schools, because I was truly involved in it. There were schools that tried to build hospitals in schools.
Oh, yeah, did everything.
You know, like
everything.
literally everything in
Food
the
banks,
school.
we're going to have a farm. Like, I've been in
And I was like, they cutting hair.
Yes.
I was like having laundry mats in the school.
Because they were taking the place of what the community
Right.
was. And I understand that.
Yeah, I understand
I
it.
understand how teachers look and say there is a need. We do need, if young people, young men can't get to the barbershop, or there is no barbershop, where are they going to get their
That's right.
haircut? Because we know a good haircut
That's right.
does change, a young boy. Just like
Man,
getting my
I
nails
had to
done.
have
Something
my
about
fade,
changing it. Yeah,
But
that's the whole
but I also
thing.
was a little nappy-headed kid. But I want to be clear about this, that schools can't be everything, and when you try to do, you take resources away from what matters most in school.
Right, which is about the knowledge of
It's
self.
right.
The knowledge
So
of self.
for me, it's like,
Yes.
and we're in this trap now that we try to load up the few things with resources to be responsible for everything. What I raise I hope everyone goes get a Black Power Scorecard, because the main charge is we have to hold ourselves accountable to these sectors, and there are roles for everyone to play.
That's what I saw in your book, and I'll wrap up by saying one of the things that I really realized here is that some of the things we're doing to make the school the end-all be-all, to make the church, it's the Band-Aid theory. That since we are bleeding, let's try to put as many Band-Aids as possible rather than getting to the root of what the real problem is, which is the infrastructure, which is why Black faces in high places don't necessarily save our community.
Right.
It's about actually revisiting what the illness is. So I appreciate the book, and it was an amazing opportunity to sit with you and to sit with the book and think about what it is that I can do as I'm challenging myself to look at the real indicators around life expectancy and what we can do to not just save our community, but to make it happy, healthy, and whole. Like, how do we get to that point? Andre Perry, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you.
Please help me thank our moderator tonight, Carsonia Wise-Whitehead. And again, tonight's author, Andre M. Perry. And so now it is up to everybody to learn more by buying a book outside from Snug Books. We will be outside in a couple of moments for the signing. Thank you for joining us, and have a great night.